the German officer who had no idea who was about to interrogate him. He sat across the table in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Aachen, hands cuffed, uniform stripped of its insignia, and he still had not figured it out. The young American officer across from him spoke flawless, unaccented German, asked questions with the precision of a man who understood military structure better than most German staff officers did, and carried himself with a calm that unsettled the prisoner far more than shouting ever could have. What the German officer did not know, could not have known, was that the young man interrogating him had been born 40 miles from where they now sat, had gone to school in Berlin, had watched his own neighbors turn their backs on his family in 1938, and had fled Germany as a teenager with nothing but a suitcase and a mother's desperate hope that he would survive long enough to grow up somewhere safe. Now he was back, not as a refugee. As the man holding the questions that would decide how the rest of this officer's war would go. This is the story of the Ritchie Boys, the thousands of young Jewish refugees who escaped Nazi Germany only to return to Europe in American uniforms, armed not with rifles, but with something the Wehrmacht never anticipated, an intimate, native understanding of the enemy's language, culture, psychology, and fear. It is the story of how the very people the Third Reich tried to erase became some of the most effective intelligence operatives in the entire Allied war effort, and how, again and again, in farmhouses and prisoner cages and shattered German towns, men who had once been hunted sat calmly across the table from the men who had done the hunting, and won. The story begins not on a battlefield, but in the mountains of Maryland, at a place called Camp Ritchie, a modest training facility the United States Army converted in 1942 into something unprecedented, a school for military intelligence built specifically around the recruitment of German-speaking refugees. Army planners had realized early in the war that they faced a critical shortage. American soldiers, however brave, however well-trained in combat, rarely spoke fluent German, understood German military terminology, or possessed any real feel for how German officers thought, spoke, or lied under pressure. But scattered across the United States, having fled Hitler's Germany and Austria in the years before the war, were thousands of young Jewish men, native German speakers, many of them highly educated, many of them possessing a personal, burning motivation to see the regime that destroyed their families brought to ruin. The Army found them, recruited them, and trained them at Camp Ritchie in a curriculum unlike anything else in the American military. They studied German unit insignia until they could identify a division by a single shoulder patch glimpsed for half a second. They memorized the order of battle of the entire Wehrmacht, learned to recognize accents that placed a prisoner's hometown within 100 miles, learned interrogation techniques that relied not on threats but on psychology, on finding the crack in a man's composure and working it gently until the truth came loose on its own. They trained in demolitions, in frontline reconnaissance, in the brutal physical conditioning that would let them operate close to combat, often ahead of it, often alone. And they trained with an understanding that the men they would eventually be interrogating were, in many cases, the very soldiers of the army that had burned their synagogues, seized their family businesses, and in some cases murdered relatives who had not escaped in time. Among the roughly 20,000 men who trained at Camp Ritchie over the course of the war, several thousand were Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria, a fact the Army did not advertise loudly, but also did not hide, because it understood the tactical value of what these men carried inside them. One of them was a young man who had been born in a quiet residential neighborhood of Berlin in the early 1920s, the son of a shopkeeper, a boy who had grown up playing in the same parks and attending the same schools as thousands of other Berlin children, until the laws began to change around him, slowly at first, then all at once. His name has been lost to most public record, as have the names of many Ritchie Boys, men who were ordered under the terms of their service to keep their real identities carefully hidden, both to protect their families still trapped in Europe and to prevent German intelligence from understanding how many of the interrogators facing captured Wehrmacht officers were, in fact, native Germans themselves. For the purposes of this story, and in honor of the thousands like him whose individual names history did not preserve, we will call him Private Erich Bauer, a name chosen to represent a very real category of men who did very real, extraordinary things. Bauer's family had run a small tailoring shop for 3 generations before 1938 arrived and took it from them, along with everything else. He remembered the night the windows were broken, remembered his father standing in the wreckage of the shop the next morning saying nothing at all, simply staring at the shattered glass reflecting the gray Berlin sky. Within a year, his parents had scraped together enough money and desperate favors to secure passage for Erich alone, a 15-year-old boy sent alone to relatives in New York while his parents stayed behind, promising to follow as soon as they could arrange papers. They never did. By the time Erich Bauer, now 19 years old and freshly commissioned as a private in the United States Army, stepped off a troop transport in England in the spring of 1944, he had not heard from his parents in over 2 years, and every letter he had sent to their old Berlin address had returned unanswered, or had not returned at all, which was somehow worse. He arrived in Normandy 6 days after the initial landings, attached to a mobile intelligence unit tasked with a job that sounded almost bureaucratic on paper, and was, in practice, one of the most psychologically demanding roles any soldier could hold. He and men like him moved just behind the front lines, sometimes disturbingly close to it, setting up temporary interrogation points in barns, church basements, requisitioned houses, anywhere with 4 walls and a door that could be closed. German prisoners, disoriented, frightened, often wounded, were brought to men like Bauer within hours of capture, sometimes within minutes, while the shock of battle was still fresh enough that tongues loosened faster than training and discipline could stop them. The genius of the Ritchie Boys' approach was that it rarely relied on cruelty. Bauer and his fellow interrogators had been trained explicitly against the brutal methods sometimes associated with wartime interrogation. Not purely for reasons of morality, though morality mattered to men who understood intimately what cruelty in the name of ideology could produce, but because psychological methods simply worked better. A frightened German soldier expecting torture, expecting the vengeance he had perhaps been warned to expect from American captors, would instead find himself offered a cigarette, spoken to in his own native dialect, asked gently about his hometown, his family, whether he had eaten recently. The disorientation this produced was profound. Men trained to expect brutality, confronted instead with calm, fluent familiarity, often began talking simply out of the powerful human need to be heard, to explain themselves, to fill a silence that no one else in that farmhouse seemed in any hurry to break. Bauer became extraordinarily good at this work, though good is a strange word for something that cost him more each time than he ever let his commanding officers see. Every prisoner who sat across from him was, in some abstract but inescapable sense, a representative of the system that had taken his parents, though he had no way of knowing, and would spend years afterward not knowing, exactly what had happened to them. He learned to set that knowledge aside during the actual work, to compartmentalize it into some sealed chamber of himself that he could open again only when he was alone, usually late at night, usually when the sounds of a nearby aid station or the distant echo of artillery made sleep impossible anyway. The breaking point, the moment that would follow Bauer for the rest of his life, came in early September 1944, during the fighting that pushed toward the German border itself. A captured Wehrmacht officer, a major with the insignia of a signals unit, sat across from him in a requisitioned school building somewhere in eastern Belgium, and something about the man's bearing, a particular kind of contemptuous confidence that Bauer recognized instantly from his childhood, from men who had walked past his father's shop with exactly that same look, told him immediately that this interrogation would be different from most. The major refused to answer basic questions at first, staring past Bauer's shoulder as though the young American interrogator were beneath his notice. Bauer, patient, methodical, tried the standard approaches, asked about the man's unit, his hometown, his family, watching for the small tells his training had taught him to read. When he mentioned, almost casually, that he himself had grown up in Berlin, the major's expression flickered, just slightly, a recalculation happening behind his eyes. He asked, with a trace of genuine curiosity breaking through his contempt, how an American soldier came to speak German so well. Bauer told him the truth. He told him he had been born in Berlin, that his family had run a tailoring business for 3 generations, that he had left in 1939 because the country of his birth had decided people like him no longer had a right to exist within its borders. He watched the major's face carefully as he said this, watched the exact moment understanding arrived, the moment the German officer realized that the young man asking him calm, precise questions about troop movements and unit strength was Jewish, was German, was, in the most literal sense possible, a living rebuke to everything the Reich had spent a decade building. The major said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, almost involuntarily, he asked what had happened to Bauer's parents. Bauer told him he did not know. That was all he said. He did not raise his voice, did not lean across the table, did not do any of the things a lesser interrogator, or simply a more human one in that particular moment, might have done. He simply repeated his original question about the disposition of the major's signals unit, and waited. Something in the exchange broke the officer's composure more thoroughly than any threat could have. He began talking, not everything at once, but steadily, over the following hour, providing details about communication networks and unit positions that would prove genuinely valuable to the Allied advance in the days that followed. Whether he talked out of some flicker of guilt, or simple professional resignation, or the particular unraveling that happens when a man's assumptions about the world are suddenly, forcibly rearranged, Bauer never fully understood. And in his later years, when he occasionally spoke about the war to family members, he admitted that he had stopped trying to understand it, had simply learned to accept that the human mind under pressure did not always follow logic that made sense from the outside. Bauer was far from alone in this work, and his experience, dramatized here to represent a broader truth, echoes the documented accounts of thousands of Ritchie Boys who served across every major campaign in the European theater. Their contributions to Allied intelligence were staggering in scope. Historians who studied their service after the war concluded that information gathered by Ritchie Boy interrogators contributed significantly to a large percentage of all actionable battlefield intelligence gathered by American forces in the European theater. An extraordinary statistic for a group that numbered only a few thousand men within an army of millions. They were present at the liberation of concentration camps, where some of them found themselves forced to process, in real time, evidence of exactly what had happened to the families and communities they had left behind, evidence that in some cases confirmed the worst possibilities they had spent years trying not to imagine. One of the most consequential moments for Ritchie Boys as a group came during the desperate fighting of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when German forces launched a massive surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, catching American units unprepared and inflicting devastating casualties in the offensive's opening days. In the chaos that followed, accurate, rapid intelligence became a matter of survival for entire American divisions suddenly fighting for their lives against an enemy whose strength and intentions had been catastrophically underestimated. Ritchie Boy interrogators worked around the clock during this period, processing captured German soldiers as quickly as they could be brought in, extracting information about unit positions, fuel supplies, and objectives that helped American commanders begin to understand the true scale and shape of the German assault. Their work in this single battle alone, conducted often within earshot of ongoing combat, under conditions of exhaustion and constant danger, would later be credited by military historians as a critical factor in the Allied ability to contain and eventually reverse what had initially looked like a war-altering German breakthrough. The psychological toll of this work on men like Bauer cannot be overstated, and it did not end when the fighting stopped. As Allied forces pushed into Germany itself in the spring of 1945, Ritchie Boys found themselves interrogating prisoners in towns and cities some of them recognized, sometimes streets away from buildings where they had once lived, gone to school, celebrated holidays with families who, in the vast majority of cases, they would eventually learn had not survived the war at all. Bauer's own story, drawing on patterns documented among real Ritchie boys who searched for family members in the war's final months, took him briefly back to Berlin itself in the confused, rubble-strewn weeks after the German surrender, where he searched municipal records and displaced persons lists for any trace of his parents, finding nothing but a neighbor, an elderly woman who had known his family before the war, who told him quietly, without elaboration, that his parents had been taken in 1942 and that no one on the street had seen them since. Bauer never received any more specific confirmation than that. He carried the uncertainty, which was its own particular kind of grief, for the rest of his life. What makes the story of the Ritchie boys so remarkable, beyond the sheer scale of their intelligence contributions, is the almost unbearable irony embedded in every interrogation they conducted. Here were young men, boys really, many of them barely out of their teenage years, who had lost their homes, their languages in the sense of ever being able to speak German again without pain, their extended families, their entire pre-war identities, to an ideology built on the claim that people like them were subhuman, dangerous, unworthy of existence. And here they were, months or years later, sitting calmly across interrogation tables from the very soldiers of the army that had enforced that ideology, holding, in that specific and temporary context, complete power over men who had once held complete power over them. It was not vengeance in any simple sense, and most Ritchie boys who spoke about their service afterward were careful to say so. It was something more complicated, a kind of quiet, devastating justice that came not through violence, but through competence, through the simple, overwhelming fact that the people the Reich had tried to erase from existence turned out to be smarter, more capable, and more essential to its final defeat than almost anyone on either side could have predicted in 1938. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Ritchie boys had participated in nearly every major campaign of the war in Europe, from the beaches of Normandy through the liberation of Paris, through the brutal winter fighting in the Ardennes, through the final collapse of the Third Reich itself. Some went on to work directly on war crimes investigations, using their language skills and intimate cultural knowledge to help build the cases that would eventually be presented at Nuremberg, ensuring that the men responsible for the systematic destruction of European Jewry would face something resembling justice, however incomplete, however inadequate to the scale of what had been done. Others returned to civilian life in America, rarely speaking about their wartime service, in part because of the security classifications that had governed their work, and in part because the specific nature of what they had experienced, sitting across tables from the architects and enforcers of their own family's destruction, was simply not something that translated easily into after-dinner conversation. Erich Bauer, as we have imagined him here in service of a true and larger history, eventually settled in New York, opened a small business that had nothing to do with tailoring or interrogation or war, married, raised children who grew up knowing only fragments of what their father had done between 1944 and 1945. It was not until decades later, as Ritchie boys began to be recognized publicly for their contributions, that historians and documentary filmmakers began tracking down the surviving members of this extraordinary unit, coaxing their stories into the historical record before the last of them passed away, taking with them memories that had, for most of their lives, remained locked in that same sealed chamber Bauer had once described, opened rarely, and only ever alone. What the story of the Ritchie boys ultimately reveals is something larger than any single interrogation, any single farmhouse conversation between a frightened German officer and the calm young American who held, however briefly, the power to shape his fate. It reveals the particular, bitter irony of a regime that spent a decade insisting an entire people were weak, subhuman, unworthy, only to be undone in part by the intelligence, resilience, and quiet courage of exactly those people, returning not with hatred as their primary weapon, but with knowledge, patience, and an unbreakable determination to see the truth extracted, piece by piece, table by table, until the war that had taken everything from them was finally, irreversibly won. The German officers who sat across those interrogation tables rarely learned the full truth of who was questioning them. Most never knew they were speaking to men who had once been their neighbors, Their fellow Berliners and Viennese, boys who had played in the same parks, attended schools a few streets away, until the law itself declared them enemies of the state they had been born into. They knew only that the young man across the table spoke perfect German, understood their army better than they sometimes understood it themselves, and somehow, without ever raising his voice, without ever resorting to threats or violence, always seemed to get exactly what he needed. They never understood the full weight of what they were facing. They never understood that the war they had helped wage against an entire people had, in the end, produced some of the very men who would help ensure that war's defeat. Erich Bauer, and the thousands of real men whose composite experience he represents, never received medals specifically honoring the particular, singular nature of what they endured. Most of their individual stories remained classified or simply unspoken for decades after the war ended. But the intelligence they gathered saved countless American lives, shortened the war by margins historians still debate and study, and ensured that when the accounting finally came, when the men responsible for the camps and the ghettos and the systematic murder of millions finally stood trial, there existed a mountain of documented, verified evidence, gathered in no small part by young men who had once been the intended victims of exactly the crimes they now helped prove. They went home quietly, most of them, back to ordinary American lives, raising families who often knew almost nothing of what their fathers had done in those farmhouses and church basements scattered across a liberated Europe. But somewhere in the historical record, preserved in declassified interrogation reports, in oral histories collected before it was too late, in the memories of the dwindling number of veterans who lived long enough to finally tell their stories, the truth of what they accomplished remains. Boys who fled Germany with nothing returned to it wearing American uniforms, and in room after room, across battlefield after battlefield, they proved, calmly, patiently, without ever needing to raise a fist, that the people their former homeland had tried to erase were among the very reasons that homeland's darkest chapter finally came to an end.